We, the people of the United States, harbor and tolerate a violent regime that stands for the privileges and profits of the great corporations. That means defending the polluting mines and factories and oil fields from Afghanistan to the Philippines, from Riyadh to Seoul. It means that when the nights are no longer cool enough to stop a fungal blight on your coffee crop in El Salvador, you're going to face a U.S.-trained war machine for 1,000 miles if you try to find a new place for your family to survive. If you try to sell the oil under your own borders to survive, you must accept U.S. puppet rulers or starve in an embargo without mercy, even as your municipal water plants come under attack. And despite what Trump believes or doesn't believe about climate change, the Pentagon has been preparing for some time. For one thing, they have anticipated an influx of climate refugees and have war-gamed accordingly. One drought can mean hundreds of thousands of people affected. So far, the U.S. brilliant and compassionate response has been to terrorize little kids and their families by separating them. And today, Trump moved to officially remove the U.S. from all further UN climate talks. So tonight we're going to look into the connections between climate change and war. We're also going to look into the hot spots of U.S. foreign policy, which include military and economic warfare in Iran, Venezuela, and Yemen. Right now there's F-16s flying over the Persian Gulf with cluster bombs. And the cluster bombs are evidently intended to wipe out the little patrol boats that the Iranians are hoping to use to defend themselves. And I bring out those little details because the situation is looking pretty ugly and it's not clear which way it will go, as has been the case for a long time, I realize, with the U.S. threatening Iran. First, I want to start with a rundown on what's going on with the U.S. wars in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, and Somalia. In Iraq, I want to frame the protests in Iraq by reminding you of what happened when the U.S. confronted ISIS in Mosul. It was an artillery duel versus a population that couldn't get away and was encouraged not to get away. They were utterly slaughtered. There were 9 of the 10 major hospitals brought down. 76 of the 98 medical centers were destroyed. 6 big bridges across the Tigris were destroyed. 3/4 of Mosul's roads. 400 educational institutions, including schools, universities, and education centers. 11,000 residential housing units. 4 electrical power plants. The place was wiped out. And when people are protesting, really they just want to live in Iraq. They're protesting against the government failing to meet basic needs as an extension of the 2003 invasion and back to the 1990 sanctions and war. Right now we have the world's largest embassy in Baghdad. It has an Olympic-sized swimming pool. It has separate buildings. It's part of a green zone which represents U.S. occupation and represents, from people who've traveled there, a weird little extension of the United States. In Iraq, it is connected to the air base there, and it is in fact a continuation of the occupation. Turning to Syria, the U.S. presence, Dan has written, is not supported by any U.S. law or UN mandate. The betrayal of the Kurds was completely predictable. And al-Baghdadi has died again. I want to bring to your attention that whenever it is convenient, Mr. al-Baghdadi is killed using jihadwatch.org. July 5th, 2014, he was said to be severely injured. Several months later, after widespread reports that he had been killed in an airstrike, he called for volcanoes of jihad. In April 21st, 2015, he was again reported seriously wounded. Bin Laden protege was reportedly leading the Islamic State after an injury to him on April 23rd, 2015. According to the UK's Guardian, he was still alive but paralyzed on April 27th, 2015. Radio Iran said he was dead on April 27th, 2015. And I'm getting ahead of myself. June 17th, 2016, he was supposed to be dead, and now he's dead. So, about Syria, Pepe Escobar wrote recently, sarcastically, "It's a quadruple win. The U.S. performs a face-saving withdrawal, which Trump can sell as avoiding a conflict with NATO ally Turkey. Turkey has the guarantee by the Russians that the Syrian army will be in control of the Turkish-Syrian border. Russia prevents a war escalation and keeps the Russia-Iran-Turkey peace process alive. And Syria will eventually regain control of the entire Northeast." Trump said the quiet part loud as he admitted openly, I didn't say that was the end of the quote, this is my writing, he admitted openly that the U.S. was only there to protect the oil, which he believes the U.S. has a right to steal, evidently. In our halcyon days, we made up excuses about freedom and democracy to steal the oil, and now with the fascist in chief, we need not bother. Turning to Afghanistan, we're promised troop withdrawals through negotiations. It was never meant to take all the U.S. forces out. I want to do a little bit of a timeline. President Obama said that he couldn't withdraw troops, and he kept, let's see, about 9,800 in place, and then saying that the situation was precarious in January 20th, 2017, he said instead of dropping the troop level, he would keep it at 8,400. In 2017, Trump warned against a hasty withdrawal and brought the number to 14,000. And September 2nd of this year, the U.S. envoy negotiating with the Taliban announced that under a deal reached in principle with the insurgent group, the first 5,000 troops would withdraw. And then on September 7th, Trump said that secret meetings between him and the Taliban leaders and with the Afghan president at Camp David were canceled, citing the death of a U.S. service member in a Taliban attack 2 days later. And given the context from what is provable, what is not provable, and what Trump usually does, he was probably lying. Turning to Libya. The U.S. caused the current chaos with the 2011 unauthorized war, and Dan Wright supports one side of the factionalized country, continues airstrikes, and wants control of resources. Al Jazeera reports heavy clashes have been reported this week between the army of the internationally recognized government of Libya and the renegade military commander Khalifa Haftar's forces on the outskirts of the capital Tripoli. Nearly 7 months after Haftar launched an offensive, the war has produced a surge in foreign support on both sides, which is bad news indeed. And skipping ahead, pro-government fighters are trying to ask for a no-fly zone because people are getting bombed from the air by drones and by jet aircraft. In Somalia, the U.S. has ground troops present and continues conventional and drone-based bombings. They recently reopened the embassy nearly 30 years after the botched invasion. And I want to add to that by saying, unfortunately, things have gotten much worse. Not only were there artillery rounds at the airstrip in Mogadishu recently, they have been flooded. From the International Committee of the Red Cross, flood rescue and recovery efforts, and I guess this touches on climate change. The Somali Red Crescent fears the floods could trigger deadly outbreaks of malaria, diarrhea, and other infectious diseases. They're quoted saying, "These floods have already cost lives, and our concern is that another fatal disaster is on its way. The main hospital in the area is flooded, and many are cut off from our clinic. We are on high alert," they say, but much more will be needed. So it's bad news in Somalia from the floods, which were very extensive, apparently. And finally, the Air Force Times says that U.S. airstrikes hit the Islamic group Al-Shabaab, extremist group Al-Shabaab, following a brazen attack on a U.S. outpost.
We have a lot of work to do in Portland, Oregon, and around the country to divest from this war machine, which, as you may or may not be surprised to hear, is supported by almost every single aspect of our day-to-day lives. And so I was asked to sit on the panel tonight to speak specifically about the interconnections, again, of the event being Stop War and the climate crisis. So when I think about the interrelations between the climate crisis and militarism around the world being driven by the US, the first thing I think of, and my mind really goes to what we saw happen just a few weeks ago. And I really want to give a huge shout out to the school strike for climate that we saw happen here in Portland and around the world. That is happening in a climate now where we're also seeing massive people's movements arising around the world, like in Chile, like in Ecuador, rising up against neoliberalism, against foreign intervention, and for actual, genuine self-determination of their future. So let's hear it for all of the amazing people's movements that are happening around the world for this. And that word self-determination brings me back to the school strike for climate, because one thing that I heard all of the student leaders talking about was that they're fighting for their future. So when we talk about the climate crisis, we are seeing an actual existential threat that children in the world today think they might not have a future to live in. And that makes me think of what the future holds for us if these wars keep on going as well. Because the global situation right now, because of the way that the US particularly is driving wars around the world, is one in which, if it's not stopped, we also don't have a future. So big shout out to the Student Strike for Climate, and I think that inspired by that, we need to see a school strike for peace and a strike against war. We need to get everyone out. It needs to be a general strike against war with Iran, against war with Venezuela, against Syria, against all occupations and all invasions. So what comes to mind when we think of the climate crisis? Just shout some things out. Fires, flash floods, droughts, famines. These are situations that are happening all around the world. I hear so many politicians say, and people say, oh, we need to stop climate change before it really starts affecting us. It already is affecting us. It's usually not affecting the people we can see. It's happening primarily in the global south, and even right here in the US, but particularly against poor and working class communities. And again, going back to the theme of our event tonight, who knows who the number one polluter is in the world? Yes, the U.S. military is the number one polluter. Would it surprise y'all to hear that the U.S. military pollutes on average more than 140 countries combined? Just the U.S. military. The U.S. military is also the number one emitter of carbon emissions. The Pentagon is fueling not only weapons technology around the world, but it's powering over 560,000 facilities around the world through those carbon emissions. The military is the number one toxic dumper. Its ships, the U.S. Navy and Marines are dumping toxic chemicals into the ocean every day, whether it's just through accidents or it's just through disposal, like how nuclear waste of our power plants is just dumped into the ocean in concrete, thinking that that's not going to come back to haunt us. And that doesn't even talk about the U.S. bases overseas that are in countries that we don't even have a right to be in the first place. Right now, these bases are contaminating land and drinking water with arsenic, with lead, with asbestos, and other toxic chemicals I don't even know the names of. I can't even pronounce. Already, $11.5 billion worth of cleanup money has gone to clean up these spills just in closed U.S. bases. This doesn't say anything about the bases that are still active. And not to mention the bombing runs that happen when the U.S. military is doing its quote-unquote exercises. We test bombs by blowing up bombs, destroying entire ecosystems, leveling whole swaths of reefs, of coastal wetlands. The number one destroyer of the environment is the Pentagon. And then we come to a very particularly sinister situation when we talk about nuclear weapons. Last year in the summer, I had the honor of attending the Protecting Mother Earth conference hosted by the Indigenous Environmental Network. And there were delegations. There was a delegation that came from Diné Navajo land, where uranium, plutonium mining is particularly taking place in indigenous communities. And I was given this narrative I had never heard before. From their creation, to their testing, to even their waste, from creation until full destruction, nuclear weapons are an assault on the land and indigenous communities. The uranium mined for these nuclear weapons takes place primarily in indigenous land using working class indigenous labor in order to mine it, leaving whole generations affected by cancer and other health defects. The quote-unquote testing, again, I love the word testing and the kind of illusion that it spells, because testing just literally means blowing them up. The testing of nuclear weapons destroys entire islands in the Marshall Islands and throughout the Pacific, leveling completely destroying islands that are no longer, there's no sign of them even existing anymore. There was one woman that I met from the Marshall Islands who told me that her family was told to evacuate, that they were given stipend, they were told they could leave, and then their island was used to test a nuclear weapon. And then years later, they were told that the cleanup had been finished and they could come back. The half-life of uranium does not allow any safe return for, I don't know if it's hundreds or thousands of years. But suffice to say, the US government does no accountability in the cleanup of these weapons. And then even after nuclear weapons have been detonated, the waste itself is then further weaponized. We keep saying we need to avoid the outbreak of nuclear war, but we've already had a nuclear war. The Gulf War was fought by the US military coating their bullets in depleted uranium that they then fired again on indigenous communities in Iraq that were trying to defend their lands. In terms of some of the effects of climate change that y'all were shouting out about, famine, flood, drought, wildfires, this is the one of the primary causes that is driving global migration today. Forced migration, as whole families are forced to flee their communities. Take just for example, Central America, where we see communities that are affected mostly, poor communities affected by the climate crisis. The countries that they are living in are recipients of US military aid that they are then use to crack down on these communities as they fight for their rights. I like to think of US military aid as how we offshore our human rights abuses, because we just give money to other governments to do the work for us. And then when they reach the border, that military aid is then used against them by our government directly, affecting primarily women and children as whole families are driven off of their land. And then when we say the US is providing climate aid, this is always militarized aid. So I think back to Hurricane Katrina, where we saw the effects on New Orleans affecting mostly poor communities. And before FEMA was sent in, the military was sent in to completely pacify working class communities of color who were trying to survive. Typhoon Haiyan, the biggest storm to hit land at that time in the Philippines, whatever aid was sent to the Filipino people was sent with a retinue of US soldiers to again pacify the population, quote unquote, as they were fighting for their rights. So, and then it is primarily environmental and land defenders who are targeted most in the global south. So the people who are actually fighting, who are standing up genuinely for true environmental and land justice, are the ones who are affected by militarization. But it's okay, right? Because Boeing has fuel-efficient jets. You can see that on their website. And we shouldn't be fooled by that. The military is an institution that uses oil to invade other countries to get more oil. And then those countries most affected by the climate crisis are then used to justify more invasions for more oil. So I want to be very clear, there is no such thing as environmentally friendly militarization. The only thing that is environmentally friendly is resistance to militarization, because the US military, again, is the primary driver of climate change. We need the whole planet united against the Pentagon. The only thing that is going to give us this future is a truly mass movement that is relentlessly targeting both militarism and the climate crisis. It has to be led by workers. It has to be led by colonized nations. It has to be led by women, youth, people of color, LGBTQ folks, and everyone who is at the forefront of both militarism and the climate crisis. So not only are these two horrific situations so linked, climate change and war, the only way to combat one of them is to combat the other simultaneously. So my hope is that the people's movements that we are seeing rising up right now are the true example of what is to come as we unite for that future that I know all of us can have together.
I do want to provide a little bit of history about U.S.-Iran relations and how it very much affects how things are today and how that legacy has just continued. So, up until the 1950s, Iran actually saw the U.S. as a symbol of freedom and as an ally, but that was until 1953. We had a democratically elected prime minister by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh, and he wanted to audit the Anglo-Iranian oil company that is now known as British Petroleum, BP. And the Anglo-Iranian oil company was not very happy about this, and there was a lot of pushback. And so the Iranian government, the parliament, voted to nationalize our oil reserves. At that point, the Anglo-Iranian oil company was the one in control of Iranian oil reserves, and they were not exactly happy with their representatives that were there in control of Iranian oil reserves being expelled from the country, with the parliament voting to nationalize our oil. Obviously, this caused a lot of tension for the United Kingdom, Britain, and so in response to this, they connected with the United States, and with the CIA, they staged a coup where Mossadegh, who was democratically elected, was removed from power, and Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was from the previous monarch family, became the Shah again and was put into power, Shah being the Farsi word for king. It's interesting to also note that this coup was the first covert action of the United States government to overthrow a foreign government during a time of peace. So everything seemed to have been pretty great, and Iranians had seen the US as this beacon of hope, and as soon as they wanted some self-determination when it came to their natural resources, the US helped the UK in overthrowing its democratically elected leader. So this policy this actually was a lesson for US policymakers that anytime, there's an unfavorable foreign government, they could simply be replaced with a dictator that's more conducive to US interests. The 1953 Iranian coup actually served as a model to carry out similar CIA-led operations in Guatemala in 1954 and Chile in 1973. And now we're seeing the uprisings in Chile as a direct result of this CIA-led action there in the 1970s. Pahlavi ended up ruling for 26 years and was very much stayed in power due to the support of the United States. He was put there by the United States and was able to rule that way for 26 years. There were many factors that played a role in the Islamic Revolution. I can't get into all of them. I mean, as it goes, the rich were getting richer, the poor were getting poorer. There was a huge discrepancy of incomes in the country. Folks felt that the country was being led by an individual propped up and supported by a foreign government. His loyalty to his country and people was questioned. Anyone can think of anything similar anywhere? Okay. There was a lot of hoarding of resources when it came to him and his close circles while the rest of the country were suffering. And so the Islamic Revolution came about in 1979. This revolution was actually brought together from folks from many different walks of life. You had extremely religious individuals. You had leftists, you had the intellectuals, you had students, you had seniors, folks from all walks of life. When you look at the pictures and videos from back in the day, the one goal was that this is a corrupt government that was put here by a foreign power, and we want self-determination. So after months and months of the majority of the country being out on the streets and basically bringing the economy to a standstill, the Shah, Reza Pahlavi, fled to the United States. So given the United States' history with Iran in the 1970s, a lot of Iranian revolutionaries were rightfully enraged with the United States because they wanted the Shah to be put on trial for all of his human rights abuses and to be sent back to the country to pay for what he had done. The Shah had gone to the United States for treatment of cancer specifically, but either way, the folks in Iran were just extremely distrusting of the fact that they saw, history repeating itself with somebody that should not have been in power in the first place being there and now being back in the United States. So in retaliation, a group of students took staff of the US Embassy hostage in November of 1979 and held them for 444 days, and they were released the day that Reagan was sworn in. So my parents were actually in Iran at this time, and they say it was an extremely volatile, terrible time because it really created this fraction amongst those that had wanted this change and this revolution because they thought this is just going to make things a lot worse. This is not the way to deal with this, versus the folks that just did not have any trust of what the United States was doing. And so the hostage crisis further compounded the hostility between the two countries.